The Empire of Ghana that grew up around the 3rd century AD is not located in the same place as the country of Ghana today. Instead, the country of Ghana was named after this civilization due to the reverence of its power. Now, who else knew about the reverence of this power? The Europeans and the Berbers, who came later. Some Arab scholars were so impressed by this area by the 1700s that they started assuming that these people were not the same as the people who live there currently. Today, all of that has been thrown away by the scholars. Although the regions of Ghana were mentioned as far back as the Romans, they never were truly mentioned as a great civilization up until the 3rd century. By this time, change had happened. The people of Ghana had the ability to travel long distances. This was due to the introduction of the camel. Something had changed. It became pretty obvious that there must be a connection between east and west of Africa. The civilizations that lie in between Ghana and Egypt also made this fact very obvious. But less of that is needed, for we know today that there was a temporary shift in the Sahara, which allowed the people of Ghana to be able to cross back and forth between Egypt. Of course, introducing the camel and introducing golden trade and creating one of the greatest civilizations in the time. This was so fascinating, and the things they built were so amazing that no scholar outside of the people who supported Africa in general thought it appropriate to give the credit to the natives of the region. These scholars would find themselves in a position of claiming that the nearest people they could find to the region were the people of Ghana. These people were the Berbers. These light skinned Berbers, as they claimed, were the ones who were responsible for this area. Now, the evidence was completely against them, because, of course, Ptolemy mentioned these people living in this region, and he mentions them as Ethiopians. Worse than this is that in the 8th century, when the Muslims started talking about the people living in this region, they claimed that their ancestors, who had been trading with them and Romans for hundreds of years, were all Negroes with little to no communication with people living as far up as Sigilamasi. Now, what would happen is a change in 8th century would divert this trade route. But before that period, they dominated trade, creating one of the most fascinating civilizations to ever grow out of Africa. Today, more and more evidence is coming against the theories that they came up with. And not only that, we know the exact culture of these people. Not only do we know the culture of these people, we also know that there must have been some contribution by these people to the Garamantes that were talked about in the past. And how do we know? Well, if we go further back than this date, the 3rd century, and we go back to the 3rd century BC and before, what we see is a culture called the Tishid culture. This culture that had already been using metals and dry stone walls as the rest of Africa used was ready to be part of a growing world. And how do we know? Well, let's read from Cambridge. The enigmatic Tishid civilization has remained relatively unheralded in the world of archaeology, despite its place as one of sub-Saharan Africa's earliest complex societies. Prior to the time of Tishit, the region was populated by diffuse groups of mobile herders and hunter-gatherers. This period has alternatively been referred to as the pre-Tishit Tishit Phase 1 or the Archaeogete phase. Pre-Tishit sites are small, relatively superficial localities, essentially temporary campsites, once thought to represent dispersed hunter-gatherers populations separated from Tishid by a brief hiatus. They are now understood to have been both pastoral and continuous with Tishit itself. Tishit civilization was thus either part of a much wider process which was sweeping the Sahel at the time, or we may yet find roots of a longer contiguous process of agricultural innovation in Mauritania. Tishit tradition settlement now expand beyond the core Tishit Walata Nema region as the Dars and the Hood Basin empty out. It's easy today to pinpoint certain locations in West Africa which would have been very important. For example, we can see that Tishit, Timbuktu, Gawa, or Gawo, located in West Africa, were very near each other. But even at the time of Ptolemy, the second century, this was confusing. There is a tower that was located in Agasimbia, as you can see written there. Agasimbia became one of those places that was an immediate trade area for Egypt, and from Agasimbia, things would be taken to the Garamantes, and from the Garamantes, they would be taken to areas which would be later considered Timbuktu and Gao, and then these places would be given to Tishit. On the journey from the Garamantes, reasoning which led to the conclusions for the reason was based upon the difference noted in the animals which inhabited the regions of Agasimbia, animals which cannot be transferred to localities outside of the limits of those assigned to them by nature. This reason does not hold likewise in reckoning the distance of the stone tower from Sarah, for throughout the whole distance, be the intervals great or small, there is the same temperature climate. It is much the same as though a man who could not be convicted by law as a thief could be convicted nevertheless according to rightful precepts. Now, I've read this before when regarding raptor, but this time we are going to read it in the context of West Africa. So here it is. At the outset, when writing of the journey from Garama to Ethiopia, he says that Septimus Flaccus, having set out from Libya with his army, came to the land of the Ethiopians from the land of Garamantes in the space of 3 months, by journeying continuously southwards. He says furthermore that Julius Meternus, setting out from Leptis Magna and Garama with the king of the Garamantes, who was beginning an expedition against the Ethiopians, by bearing continuously southwards, came within 4 months to Agasimbia, the country of the Ethiopians, where the rhinoceros is to be found. Each of these statements on the face of it is incredible. First, because the Ethiopians are not so far distant from the Garamantes as to require a 3 months journey, seeing that the Garamantes are themselves, for the most part, Ethiopians, and have the same king. Secondly, because it is ridiculous to think that a king should march through regions subject to him only in the southerly direction, when the inhabitants of those regions are scattered widely east and west, and ridiculous also that they have never made a single halt that would alter the reckoning. Something that makes us understand the exact locations of these areas and how far extended the Garamantes are the rivers laid out for us, like Lake Chad, the Niger River, and of course the Nile. But the Nile is not interesting to us now because, of course, we are talking about West Africa. Located in West Africa is the Niger River. This river was located and seen by the Romans, and these Romans gave it a name. They called it Niger. They said it a different way than that. But this river that they found in this region, they showed that also the Garamantes were capable of getting to this region. These Garamantes, who are Ethiopians themselves, were also extending their influence throughout this region. Now, Leptis Magna, located at the top, you can see is very far to the north, and the Garamantes had access to Leptis Magna. Therefore, Leptis Magna, all the way down, represented by the red line, was the trade region of the Garamantes. The green line also shows how the Garamantes had a different route from Libya all the way down to Agasimbia. This is not a trade route of just Garamantes. In fact, these lines represent the trade route of the Libyans or the Roman type Libyans traveling down, but it's a good indicator of the regions where the Garamantes lived, and these Garamantes had direct communication with the people of Thichit, which are the people who ran and lived in Ghana or the Ghana Empire. The other large river is the Niger flowing from the Mandris Mountains and the Thala Mountains, which from the Negritis Lake, which is in from the north, two rivers flow unto the same from the Sagapola and the Usargala Mountains, a deflection towards the east from the Libyan take the location which is in 35 1630, and towards the south moreover there is a turn towards the Daradus River, but in two locations, 21 and 17. And to avoid confusion, I have to illustrate to you guys right now that when I say Mauritania in the next sentence that is going to be read, I am not talking about the country of Mauritania, even though this is the area where the Ghana Empire had some bordered areas that belonged to it and had great influence throughout the entire region. And of course, we will go into stones that were found within Mauritania and found south of Mauritania that shows that these people were conquering or expanding largely due to their technological reality and their technological intellect at the time that supposedly made them better than a lot of their neighbors at the time, to the point that they could occupy them in an empire by the 3rd century. So I am not talking about Mauritania, the country. I'm talking about Mauritania to the north. I'm talking about Mauritania Tingatina and Mauritania Caesarensis. And these two Mauritanias, which are going to be mentioned, had great direction or great influence going south there in terms of trade. And this is in the time of Ptolemy, which is going to be written about now. But before we do this, I want to remind you that, remember, we found that there were old civilizations going back BC, like 2000 BC, here in the Mauritania regions. And we also found that there were civilizations going down in the Mauritania proper, so going down to Morocco, then Mauritania, the country proper. We found that there are rock structures found in that area. If you don't know, just look back a little bit, you'll find it in my channel, me talking about these two. Gaitoli is located below Mauritania, the desert of Libya below Africa and Cyrenia. The great races which inhabit Libya are the Garamantes, extending from the source of the Baghdad River to the Nubus Lake, and the race of the Melengaitoli, who occupy the land which is between the Sagapala Mountains and the Ursagala Mountains, and the Ethiopian race of Giray, who dwell towards the south of Gir River, and the Ethiopian race of the Nigrite, who are north of the Niger River, and the Daradi, who dwell along the river of the name Daradas, where it empties into the sea, and the Parosi, who are more to eastward and more remote from the sea, as far as the mountains which are called Theon Okema, and the land of the Ethiopian Odregede, located between the Caphis and the Thala mountains, and the Mamikis, who are below the Thala Mountains, and the Nube dwell on the western side of the Garamanti defile, and the Debreke, who are towards the west of the Arankes Mountains. Now, as you can see here, this is almost a detailed writing about the people who occupied this region in the second century in Central to West Africa. It is kind of funny to sit down and try and prove that the people living in Africa were Ethiopians. It almost feels pointless to some degree, but at least he breaks down the types of Ethiopians living in these regions. Now, these arrows represent the several sides based on his writings, which I just went over myself, that show that these people were expanding in different locations. So instead of reading it, I've already read it, but instead of reading it, let's talk about it. So of course, we have the bottom part, which represents the heading to Leptis Magna. So the top arrow that you see, the one in the middle represents a certain part of a river that goes all the way to Leptis Magna again, and then the direct route to Egypt, and then another route from south of the Niger going all the way to Agasimbia, and then from West Africa, the southern part of West Africa, going to the Abyssinian regions, and then Rapta. Although we know that the camel would be colonized by the third century by these people, it is actually false to assume that they didn't exist prior to this date. But Ptolemy himself does not mention them. And he actually sits down and lists the types of animals that you could find in these regions. At no point does he make it a big point to point out camels at all. In fact, he almost never talks about camels, even in the case of Egypt. Remember that when he talks about Agasimbia, the one animal that he is very interested in is the rhinoceros. Though we cannot 100% pinpoint which Ethiopians he is talking about when he's talking about the people living in this region, we know that region wise, the ones that I've just listed are 100% living in the region where the Ghana Empire would be. But we do not know exactly if they represent the tribe that would form the Ghana Empire. And how do we know this? Well, if we look again at the writing, and remember what I told you where Mauritania is according to him, so that north part, that little tip of Libya. So it says there are minor races, the Serengare, the Mosololi, the Otololi, occupying the region, which is on the sea below Gaitali, extending as far as Mandrus Mountains. So these Mandrus Mountains are located in Gaitali. If we go further south, as it says here, the Malkur and the Mandari extending as far as the Daradi. Next to these is the Sofe, and below these, again, we keep going further south, the Risidis Mountains are the Liker Ethiopians, between whom and Perosi stretches the Campus Rufus. Then from the Sagapa Mountains towards the north of Pharisee, from the Usergala Mountains towards the north of Netum. So that's enough of that Roman. What we need to know now and focus back on the Ghana Empire is what exactly did they provide? Well, let's look at this item right here. It's from the 7th century and it was found to belong to the Empire of Ghana. This gold item represented something very important. But more than this, it represented a truth that was said by Al Masudi. See, Al Masudi, in talking about the Ethiopians in the 8th century, said that they extend as far as the territories of Idris bin Idris. Idris bin Idris was occupying that area that again we called Mauritania. Idris bin Idris For going south of Idris bin Idris's territory, he mentions that there are Ethiopians over there who trade in gold. He calls them Sudan, but these Sudan are truly Ethiopians. If we also focus on less shinier objects, like the pottery in that region, it is very consistent with the rest of the pottery found in West Africa. This type of pottery, of course, is one of the earliest in the world. And remember, this pottery at one time was or had the same date as the earliest in the world until other pottery was found later. But this goes back to about 7000 BC. Lower than this region, we can find pottery that goes back even further back, 10,000 BC. But we've already talked about several empires that are not this particular region, so let us not divert our attention, except for a moment. So, what we are looking at here are a wide expanse of pre colonial BC, going back about 2000 BC all the way to the birth of Jesus, two concepts that are very similar that represent probably a working network of civilizations in the region. So, what you're looking at is a mountain, Tumaloos, that is made of rocks. So, these rocks were taken from a specific area and moved here on burial, moved in that region, which would become the Ghana Empire. Just south, in Senegambia, we have Tumaloos, but these Tumaloos are also decorated with standing stoneworks. Ignore them for now because we will talk about them only when we get to Senegambia, a completely different subject altogether. Even though these Tumaloos might be related to the people living to Gaitali or even further north, what it shows is that these people, because earlier we did not have any evidence of other people from a different period having this level of technology this early, it shows that these people independently created a culture that worked with these certain types of technologies. Now, these Thumalus, as they called by these researchers, are a represented represented as a field or network of Thumalus, not relating to just one. As we read, the funerary monuments of the Western Sahara and their wider Saharan context, the Western Sahara Project has documented an extraordinary wealth of stone built monuments which throughout the Sahara are firmly associated with pastoral populations. These are interpreted as dating to the period 3000 BC to AD 800 on the basis of the similarities with dated funerary monuments from Libya and Niger. Radiocarbon dates on long bones from the individuals interred in two simple conical timalu in the TFI study area have returned dates between AD 480 and 820, but are likely to fall in the first half of the first millennium AD. The interments within the Tumalu and general morphology of the funerary architecture are in keeping with wider Saharan funerary practices of the period, although only two monuments have been radiocarbon dated, and these are late in the overall relative sequence of funerary monuments. The density and variety of monuments suggest that the regions around Tifariti was utilized for a considerable period of time. A total of 400 stone-built features, funerary and other ceremonial monuments were recorded during systematic survey in the TFI study area. A further 437 and 337 features, respectively, have been recorded through extensive survey in the northern and southern sectors of the Free Zone and are likely represented just as a small fraction of the monuments present in these regions. In addition, Gother has supplemented these data through the mapping of monuments seen on high resolution Google Earth imagery. Milburn has undertaken independent studies of specific types of funerary monuments in Western Sahara. The funerary monuments and other examples of ceremonial architecture have been grouped into 32 morphological types. Many of these are identical or similar to monument types found throughout Western and Central Sahara, including Morocco, Mauritania, Algeria, Libya, and northern Niger. Some, such as the Mounds or Tumalo platforms, Tumalo Bazanis or Carbius, monuments and V-type monuments have a wide spatial and chronological distribution across the Sahara and confirm that Western Sahara sits firmly within a wider Saharan pastoral tradition. Mound-shaped tumuli are by far the most numerous funerary monuments in the TFI area and more widely in the Sahara. In their simplest form, they are mounded stone ranging from m to over 10 m in diameter and up to 175 m in visible around the circumference of some tumuli, while others have false entrances, niches, or authorities. A subgroup are known as a platform tumuli because they are situated on top of a circular and subcircular pavement, a stone usually no more than 0.2 meters high and in most cases outlined by a curb. In some cases, platform have been formed by extending and accentuating a natural platform through the use of boulders as curbstones to complete the platform or parameter. Sorry, I read that like that. I made it small so I can't see properly. Now, there is a lot that we can draw from this. Now, first of all, like I told you, even in places like Senegambia, there are Tumaloos, so we can see that it is a wider West African tradition, not just one that is only in the South. Also, the new discovery that we found in the northern regions of Africa should, to some degree, be taken as very likely to be related to these other West African civilizations. Another thing that is important is the stone circledness about it. Why? Well, let's go back to the structure that I showed you earlier, or the item I showed you earlier. Remember, there were false doors, false terraces, and then it's stone circles. It is easier to see now that what we are looking at is a representation, a top view map of the Tumaloos. The first representing a fully closed structure with no entrance. The second one you can see has two entrances on the sides. Then you can see right in the middle, no entrance, and you can see some pillars standing up. This is a representation of Tumaloos. There is some indication that there is also some influence of Islam on this structure. Now, you don't have to believe me or anybody else in order to understand what it is. Look at it yourself. Does it not look to you like the Tumaloos being represented? Okay, well, you don't believe me. Let's read what the experts believe it is. The exceptional quality and weight of the pectoral make it one of the most impressive of the burial goods found at the site of northwest Senegal. Its decoration, elaborated in the registers of bosses, Arabesque, and diamond patterns made out of filigree, suggest an awareness of Islamic workmanship. The practice of erecting large mounds of Tumaloo over the graves of important individuals in the Sahel is related to a commemorative practice and beliefs that precede the arrival of Islam and continued well beyond its adoption into the 14th century. So you can see here there is a mention of these Tumalu mounds, which are represented here, but there's also mention of Islam, which also affected these people's artistic creations at this period. These people who now have become Muslims had their own representations. And you can see by looking at other ones like this that they represent something else. Now, to not bring up another civilization as if we need another one, this takes me back to Central Africa and the Niger regions, where we looked at the patterns of clothing, where some clothing would be represented in circular patterns, and they would talk about entering. So you have holes and holes, and it's entering, always going in, always going in. And this is how you look at I don't want to call it the underworld. You look at the world of the living versus the world of the dead. The world of the living being the outermost part, and the world of the dead or the world of the spirits being the innermost part. So this other ornament that is represented this time not by Tumaloos, but by some of the structures or some of the patterns that you will see on clothing representing people living both in West Africa, North Africa, and also in Southern Africa since the spread of the Bantu migration. Two things that I want to draw to your attention: the two triangles. Those two triangles are recognizably and obviously the mother father triangles that you usually see represented by both Bantu people and Moors, as I will show in a later time. You can see on the side possible mountains, and also they might be representing this mother father thing. And this is considered pagan. In other words, there's nothing Islamic about this one at all. So, as we read, during the 11th and 12th centuries, Silla and Takrur were the preeminent trade centers on the Senegal River for the export of gold and slaves. Silla, which researchers speculate may be the site of Sinkabara, was a 20-day march from its peer state Ghana, with a population that had converted to Islam and a king who was at war with the pagan neighbors. This artifact was found in Sinkabara among other finely decorated artifacts cast in brass and copper, evidence of a vibrant craftsmanship and taste for luxury of the Middle Senegal Valley at the time of the expanding Trans-Saharan exchange. Now, something that is very important, which I should have mentioned earlier, but I want to add that to a different video because we're not talking about how it expanded just yet. We're only talking about who these people were. So, countries involved in this empire are Senegal, Mali, and Mauritania. Only pieces of these areas or these countries would belong to the empires of Ghana. So let's not look at it as the entire region, but instead that small one. This is why we know that there is a greater expanse. And speaking about a greater expanse, let's go back to that ornament. And I will leave you with this so you understand how magical what we're talking about is. If you notice, these triangles and the dots act as these extras on top of the thing. So you see the frog associated with fertility and also magical rites. This triangle, the triangles in the middle that look like the one that is on the second row in the middle, you can see frog associated with fertility is similar to the one in the middle in this item. And if we go and look at Zulu or Bantu, but the Zulu meaning of this, we see There too, the diamond shape, meaning feminine. So with here it's fertility, with here it's feminine, and you can assume that feminine means fertility. If you look down and at the very last structure, you can see there that when they point together, it represents a husband and wife, and when they're doing this diamond shape, they represent femininity. I hope you enjoyed that video. I will admit that some of the videos that I put up were kind of filler so that I could perfectly get some of the information for this video. So thank you very much for bearing with me. Like, share, subscribe. Feel free to donate, and also, any amount helps, by the way, because the views are not exactly where I would like them to be. So thank you very much. Uh, keep on rocking in the free world and do 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 do.